Hi. So it's 5:30 on a Monday afternoon here, evening. Awful weather the last few days. Feels like almost every time I talk on a video, talking about how shit the weather is. But this year has been some of the worst weather that I can remember in my living memory. At least, it's been raining incessantly since the new year. Good 6 months is just pissed down. And now we got the added bonus of like severe gale force winds at the moment. But ever have the feeling where it's the end of the weekend and you just don't feel like you've had a weekend at all? My weekend this week was Sunday and Monday, and it's just I feel like I just left work about 5 minutes ago. But anyway, what can we see here? Bush and more bush and even more bush. That's out of order, isn't it? It should be like that. The first three albums of the British grunge, post-grunge, alternative rock act, Bush. And Bush, fairly divisive in their popularity or people's attitudes or opinions towards them. In some ways, they kind of preceded Nickelback, and maybe not as hated as Nickelback. But I remember when I was a young man at school, if you admitted you like Bush, um, I remember I have a memory of sitting in the back of a bus, a school bus, and one guy next to me was like, like sometimes people like make the sound effects of guitars, like do 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 do. He was doing that, do 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 do, and I said, "Oh, you're humming the song Machine Head by Bush," and he was like, "No, I'm not." And how do you? And then he said to me, "How do you even know what that song sounds like? Do you like Bush?" And I was like, and I remember my excuse for knowing, it wasn't an excuse, it was actually true because I was never a fan of Bush. My excuse for knowing was that they used that song Machine Head on a snowboarding video. Remember, there used to be like surfing and snowboarding videos? You would buy like VHS tapes of like an hour of skating or of, like famous skaters or in this case, snowboarders, and they'd have background music. Was that a thing in other countries? Anyway, my point in that story is that yeah, there was like a certain level of disdain for Bush, and in some ways I could understand that. They came at the end of the grunge wave. 16 Stone was released the same year Kurt Cobain died. Um, Not sure exactly what month. It probably would have been after he passed away, I would guess, because he died in April. But he they were accused of ripping off Nirvana and grunge in general. Um, December '98. So yeah, really kind of they're trying to cash in at the end of this thing. Um, the songs were also seemed to be kind of like quite, I don't know, I was gonna say like calculated. It's almost like alternative rock by numbers. I think a lot of people felt this first album, 16 Stone. That's a dog, by the way. It's like a mop. Was put out by Interscope and Trauma. I don't know exactly why they had two record labels. But this was a big album. This sold a couple of million, at least a couple of million records around the world, more than a couple of million, and they were bigger in the US than they were in their homeland of Britain. The song off that kind of particularly was particularly popular was Glycerine, and Glycerine was kind of like in the same way in the 1980s hair metal bands had like a power ballad like Home Sweet Home by Motley Crue or Every Rose Had Its Thorn by Poison or some of those other ones which I can't quite think of at the moment. Well, this was kind of like it didn't sound anything like that kind of music, but I'm just saying that was almost kind of, it felt like that was grunge's version of that, like a song that didn't have any drums. It was basically just the vocalist and a guitar, and they also had quite a bit of a string section as well, but not strings in the way of like Something in the Way by Nirvana, very kind of uh, subtly mixed. The strings in Glycerine were much more up the front. Although I will say I like the coda of Glycerine, just the strings by themselves doing that kind of quite sad, mournful sound at the right at the end. But big songs off this where everything's in, which even now I can't stand that song. Swim, I think, is a nothing song. Bomb sounds really like they're trying to be Nirvana at their more experimental side. Little Things, that's an okay song. Don't mind Little Things. Come Down was a big song, but I don't like it. Body, Machine Head, I was just talking about that before. I think that's actually an okay song. I think the kind of the starting riff of that is okay. Um, Testosterone and Monkey, they kind of blend into each other. Glycerine, I was talked about, was kind of the biggest hit. Um, just overall, I didn't like this album, and I still don't really like it a whole lot. I buy these things because I particularly buy a lot of things around that alternative rock grunge era from like say 89 through 96, particularly 91 to 94, I guess is the main things I buy. But uh, and also the I guess the other reason, kind of going back to what I was saying before, that they were kind of disliked or hated, is that the singer, I've talked about this before with Silverchair, having a very handsome, popular with the ladies vocalist, it can be a double-edged sword, because on the one hand you get a big chunk of the female market, and they always say if you want to truly be worldwide popular, you can't just appeal to just the dudes or just the ladies. You need to have a mix of both to kind of get to that other level. If you go to a U2 concert, it's not like a sausage fest, is it? It's not all guys. It's, I don't know what would be the proportion breakdown, but it'd probably be close to 50-50. Um, and he is still even in his kind of middle age years, a very handsome guy, smoldering good looks, and that kind of pushes some people away. They think, oh, he's just a pretty boy, and then the whole thing of, oh, girls like him, and maybe there's a certain level of jealousy there, maybe. Um, and then there was the added thing of the inauthenticity, that these guys came at the tail end of grunge, and it seemed like they were just kind of copying the different elements, especially Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and some of those other bands, and then kind of, you know, funneling it down into this kind of finished product of uber grunge, even though I don't think it was particularly grungy, if you ask me. But then there was also he was in a few bands before Bush in the late 80s, and if you listen to those, they're basically like 80s pop bands. um I don't know who like if you take some of those 80s new romantic and then electro pop of the later 80s from Britain, if you imagine those bands, that's what it sounded like. His voice was a lot cleaner, Gavin Rossdale. It didn't have the gravel. If you notice, when he sings, he's got quite a clean on the entry of the vocal, and then it has this rough gravelly bit at the end, like that. He didn't have that in this previous band, and of course, as you age, your voice changes, and as your voice gets wear and tear, it kind of changes as well. But a lot of people would say, well, he was in a pop band before, now suddenly he's got this kind of grungy voice. What's going on? And you can say whatever you want to say about some of those other bands, but you listen to Kurt Cobain's early work before, never mind, he wasn't in singing pop music. You can see the linear path from his, youth through to superstardom and how he was kind of authentic. And you maybe can't say the same thing about Gavin Rossdale. Then they came out, what this I said, there's 94. I think 96, late 96, they came out with Razorblade Suitcase, which I think is a little bit of a better album. The two singles, was Greedy Fly a single? Swallowed was definitely a single. I'm not sure if Greedy Fly was a single. I like those two songs. I particularly like Swallowed. And if you'd asked me when it first came out if I liked that song, I probably would have said no. But in the last, 5 years, I kind of heard it again after many years of not hearing. I thought, actually, this is not a bad song. I particularly like the second verse where the guitar drops out and it's just the bass and him, Gavin, singing. It's just the bass line. And then the guitar kind of chops back in for a little bit and then chops out again. And they kind of descend as that big chorus. What else on here? A Tendency to Start Fires, History, I think are okay. Straight No Chaser. Don't like Bone Driven. Again, in the vein of Glycerine. This was produced by Steve Albini, and you can hear his production style, not to the extent of some of his other works. The drums are a little bit dialed down, but you can still hear it come through from time to time. And I'd say overall it's a better album than 16 Stone. Still not amazing, but yeah. By this stage, 96, alternative rock grunge was really on its last legs. And what I don't mean is like it was hated or anything. It was just, the music landscape had evolved. Things had changed as they always do. And I'm just saying someone who's kind of clinging on to that sound of the early 90s is going to sound somewhat dated. And so they have to be moving along. And they did when they came to 1999, The Science of Things. And personally, I think this album is better. It's kind of like they got progressively better. Don't really like this, although I can understand why the singles did well. A little bit better, and again, better still. This has got a bit more a variety of sound. They incorporate some of that late 90s electronic trip hop, drum machine, loops start kind of coming in bits and places. I particularly like the guitar sound in some of the songs, the guitar tone, which previously in the other two albums, the guitar tone was like nothing. I was not saying it was terrible, it's just nothing you even noticed. But for me, if I even notice a guitar tone, it's got to have something special or different about it. And there's a couple of times in this album where I particularly like the guitar tone, especially in the single Chemicals Between Us. It's got some kind of processing on it. I don't know exactly what they've done to it, but it kind of sounds different. War Machine, like that song. Like I said, Chemicals Between Us, I like that song. English Fire is interesting, it's different. Space Travel 40 Miles from the Sun. I'd say at least it sounds like they're trying something different. They're trying to push away from the previous two albums' sounds and that 90s rock sound. Not completely spinning off into anything wildly experimental or anything, but they're not making the same album over and over again. But they were selling progressively less albums from their height in 94, 95, 96. They slowly kind of, going down as most bands do. The other single was Letting the Cable Sleep, which is an okay song. Again, kind of sounds like this album's Glycerine, if you ask me. Yeah. Oh, that's right. It's also got that song, The Disease of Dancing Cats, which as soon as I read that title, I was like, they're talking about Minamata. Was it Minamoto? Minamata disease. in Japan in the was it the 50s or the 60s, where this company were dumping mercury into Minamata Bay, and then it was like poisoning the town around it. And I think the first sign they had of something was wrong was the cats. The cats were ingesting the fish, which had huge levels of mercury, and then when you are poisoned with mercury, you kind of lose function of your limbs, or at least knowingly. So you feel, it seems like you're kind of dancing, but you're not. It means you're being poisoned by mercury and probably slowly dying. Um, so interesting that he chose to write a song about Minamata disease. Is it Minamata? I feel like I'm pronouncing it wrong. Hang on. No, it is Minamata. Apparently, they made a movie about her in 2020 with Johnny Depp. Be interesting. Um, so yeah, that's the three albums that I own. All of these secondhand, obviously. I wouldn't buy Bush new. Actually, kind of took me a while. I for a long time I saw this in lots of secondhand stores. You do see both of these in secondhand stores a lot because they were super popular, especially this one, very very popular in New Zealand in the mid-90s, as I'm sure they were in most of your countries. And so you see this a lot. And I saw it for like a year, and I always say, I'm not going to get that. And then I got this, and then I thought, oh, I'll go back and get this. And then I think quite recently I found this one. But just to finish off, there was a good a good kind of appraisal of some people's feelings towards Bush. So this is on Wikipedia. It said, Bush was a good band who just happened to signal the beginning of the end. Ultimately, they would become the grunge Warrant. You know, Warrant with that hair metal band, She's My Cherry Pie and all that kind of stuff. And they were kind of derided as fake, plastic, towards the end of the 80s, not real, whatever real hair metal would be. And then he goes on to say, the 12 songs and 16 Stones sound exactly what grunge is supposed to sound like. But the whole point of grunge was that it didn't really sound like anything, including itself. Just consider how many different bands and styles of music have been shoved under the grunge header in this discography alone. And you realize that grunge is probably the most ill-defined genre of music in history, which is an interesting way of looking at it. Whereas you had, like I've said before, Soundgarden, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, if we say the big four of grunge, really are completely different stylistically. They got heavy guitars, I guess we could say that. But, Nirvana much more on the punk end of it, whereas Soundgarden much more on the kind of metal, psychedelic end. But we just put it under this umbrella of grunge. Whereas we had this band Bush who kind of took all that and coalesced it into this thing, and we're like I said, the uber grunge sound. But really, what was grunge? The whole point of grunge is that it didn't have a sound. And if you're taking one thing in particular, maybe you're not being real, is maybe what he was trying to say there. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Thanks for watching.